More than WandaVision and way more than Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Loki is ripping into topics that could have massive effects on the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so let's dive into them right now. Hey guys, it's Sean O'Connell, the managing editor here at CinemaBlend, and we are starting an analysis of the new Marvel series, Loki. We've done this for WandaVision, we did it for Falcon and Winter Soldier. By now you should know how we're going to do this. You will have seen the episode, because we're going to dig into spoilers, and we're going to go through all sorts of analysis about things that are laid out. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the clip, there's so much going on in Loki that requires full-blown breakdowns and analysis. I've watched this first episode 3 times, and by the end of the 3rd time, I think I finally got it, or at least, kind of think I understand what's happening in it.
I am smart. Okay.
So I'm going to go through 5 main topics that sort of blew my mind and led to much larger sort of questions and conversations and discussions I want to have about how it affects the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So last warning, spoilers, we're diving into the first episode of Loki right now.
Glorious.
So let's start with just the fact that there is confirmation of the existence of a sacred timeline that all things are supposed to be following. And so there's a big information dump when Loki arrives at the TVA, and you learn that at one point there was a vast multiversal war, which we'll talk about in the next section. And because of that, there are these 3 timekeepers, and they are in charge of dictating the proper flow of time. Think about it as this one sort of beam that everything in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is following, and it has to keep going along that flow, according to the sacred timeline, in order to make sure that there are no disruptions. Even to the point where it's confirmed in the first episode that the Avengers going back in time in Endgame was supposed to happen, according to the timekeepers, and that's why they didn't really disrupt everything that was going on with the sacred timeline. That was destined to take place, which is a little bit confusing on the surface, but I understand. The thing that wasn't supposed to take place with the Avengers jumping back in time was Loki picking up the Tesseract and disappearing in that one scene with Tony Stark in the lobby of the building in Avengers. And that's, as you know, where the episode picks up and shows Loki sort of escaping and getting picked up by the TVA. But the concept that there is this massive sacred timeline, that all of the events from, all of time, but of course we're focusing on the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that all of those events have to stay along this sacred timeline, and anytime that they branch off, it's called a nexus event, and you become a variant because you have removed yourself from the sacred timeline. That is a sort of heady thing to get our head around, because it asks a lot of questions about what happens if you're not on the sacred timeline any longer, and how many things are attached to the sacred timeline, and how are events manipulated or dictated if they come away from the sacred timeline. Some of it is explored in the rest of this first episode, and we'll break it down, but I think there's plenty of other questions that have to come up with in terms of where can characters go off of the sacred timeline, and what kind of effect could it have on the MCU moving forward.
Precisely.
All right, so let's get back to that vast multiversal war. It just gets mentioned in one line.
Long ago, there was a vast multiversal war.
It was all these timelines or multiverses that were at war with each other to determine which one was going to be most important. They've now sort of weaved themselves into one strong fabric, but they do mention the fact that if there is ever a Nexus event and it isn't corrected by the TVA, it could relaunch a multiversal war. Now, that's intriguing to me because there's 2 projects on the MCU future that could be really important with regards to the multiverse, and one of them is next year in March, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which we have been told is really going to tie into some of the things that happened with WandaVision, with the way that Wanda sort of created that dome in which the town existed. She could have done some stuff to disrupt the sacred timeline, but also Doctor Strange suggesting the concept of the multiverse is some things that he brought up in his own first movie, and so we expect that to come up as an important plot point in that sequel. Before we even get there, though, December is Spider-Man No Way Home, and while none of this has been confirmed at this point, there's so many rumors going around that the multiverse is going to play an important part because other characters from the different Spider-Man Sony movies, whether it be Alfred Molina's Dr. Octopus or Jamie Foxx's Electro, could come over from those timelines and land into Tom Holland's Spider-Man universe. Now, are they variants? And are they, is a Nexus event going to happen on their multiverse timelines that would catapult them into this world? Loki's only a 6-episode series, and so it would have to get through a lot of that explanation really quickly to explain how we could get to that point, but by the time that Loki ends, we might have some kind of explanation that's tied through the existence of that one vast multiversal war that explains how and why Dr. Octopus and Electro and maybe some other Doctor Strange villains could come into the MCU, because now the concept has sort of been established through the existence of the TVA that all of this stuff is possible.
Good, let's go with that.
Okay, we haven't really even dived into the existence of the TVA as an organization, which in and itself is fairly mind-blowing. While I was watching this, multiple times I kind of asked myself, like, where even are they? And I know that that's a weird concept to get into, because they talk about the fact of, like, time moves differently in the TVA, and when you're in the TVA, the rules of time don't necessarily apply. To this point, you have to keep reminding yourself that the Loki that we are watching on the television series is the one who has just been taken out of Avengers 2012, the first Avengers movie. And while he's in the TVA, he's able to scour through the timeline and watch the events as they are supposed to play out for him on the sacred timeline. And that includes Thor: The Dark World, where he's responsible for his mother's death. It leads all the way through to his own death at the hands of Thanos in Infinity War.
A sampling of your greatest hits, if I may.
But you ask yourself, like, how is he able to stay in this little time pocket removed from the first Avengers movie and yet still, scan forward and see what's going on in the timeline? And it's only just because the TVA is some sort of bizarro organization where the rules of time and space don't necessarily apply to it. And one of the rules that is established very much in the TVA is when Loki tries to use his own magic, and he can't.
Damn it, why would it work?
Magic powers. They're no good in the TVA, Mr. Laufeyson.
And you know what other powers don't work is the Infinity Stones. And that drawer of Infinity Stones was a super bizarre revelation, but it put a lot of things into perspective. And again, having seen it a bunch of different times, what it says to me is that there were other times along the timeline in the past where other people tried to create sort of these Nexus events where they used the Infinity Stones to break away from the sacred timeline, and they got apprehended by TVA agents, who then took the Infinity Stones away from these people and brought them back to the TVA, where they immediately lost all power and essentially had the value of paperweights. So Thanos is not the first person who's ever tried to retrieve all the Infinity Stones. Now, maybe he's the first one to try to go after all of them, but basically the way that Loki showed up with the Tesseract at the beginning of this episode, and they didn't really know what it was, and they just kind of passed it along to be filed as a piece of evidence in his own case. There are multiple Infinity Stones that are just hanging out in the TVA and are completely powerless and have no impact. And it's only then, when Loki sees that, the Infinity Stones lose all their power in the TVA, that he realizes that their ability to control time, to move through time, and to prevent certain things from happening in time is way more powerful than any of the things that he was trying to achieve over the course of his ascension to become god of, or king of Midgard, essentially.
AKA Earth.
And that is pretty terrifying, because it goes to show you how strong the TVA can and might potentially be in the MCU.
Is this the greatest power in the universe?
So what does all that mean? I mean, the major question that is being asked by the first episode of Loki, and this is an enormous bite to take off of this apple of the MCU, is that free will might not exist in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And in one of his most heated exchanges, Loki is arguing with Agent Mobius, saying that he rejects the notion that his actions are not in his control.
I live within whatever path I choose.
Sure you do.
That if he were to succeed at taking over Earth, it wouldn't be because these three timekeepers have determined that it was supposed to happen because the sacred timeline exists. But, Agent Mobius is explaining to him that that's basically the belief that the TVA is supposed to be ascribed to, and they don't think any differently because this is all that they know. The sacred timeline is moving forward, everyone is following what's supposed to happen, but it does remove the element of can you control or dictate your future by making different decisions. Now, there is a line or a bit of dialogue where Loki kind of says, like,
I know what this place is.
What is it?
It's an illusion. It's a cruel, elaborate trick conjured by the weak to inspire fear.
Loki's saying, I think the TVA is a sort of Wizard of Oz type illusion. Like, don't pay any attention to the man behind the curtain, right? There is no Wizard of Oz. It's just a guy. And there might not be a real TVA. There might not be real timekeepers. There might not be a sacred timeline. And there might actually be free will, but the way that they're describing it right now is that all of the actions that are taking place in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or supposed to take place in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, are being dictated by these three timekeepers. And all the things that have happened so far are supposed to happen, including the Avengers in Endgame deciding, hey, we got to go back into time and retrieve the time stones, or retrieve the Infinity Stones, in order to get them before Thanos does and put the Infinity Gauntlet back together. According to this first episode of Loki, the timekeepers were like, yeah, that was supposed to happen. You guys are supposed to go back in time and fix all that stuff. And so it kind of blows your mind to think that, like, everything we've seen play out was following along with this sacred timeline that is being established by these three timekeepers.
What's so funny?
Glorious purpose.
In addition to investigating Loki's current case, they're looking into another ongoing case where someone is deliberately creating Nexus events and separating themselves off the timeline in order to lure TVA agents to their location. And then they're wiping them out, literally killing TVA agents, but in order to get timeline reset capsules. So whenever the TVA goes off to investigate a Nexus event, and a Nexus event branches away from the main timeline, they go and they prevent it from happening, and then they drop these little capsules down, and the capsules restore the timeline, or reset the timeline, and wipe away everything that had happened so that you're not aware of that deviation. Someone is able to live inside of the deviations, though, and eliminate the TVA agents, and then take their timeline reset capsules. We don't know why yet, but at the very end of the episode, we learned that
the variant we're hunting is you.
Now, that blows your mind, because you have to ask yourself, like, what Loki could it be? Or which Loki could it be? Or where is that Loki coming from? Or when is that Loki coming from? Is it even Loki? It's a great sort of cliffhanger end for the first episode.
What did you expect?
All we know is that someone in a shroud or a hood is killing off TVA agents, is collecting those timeline reset capsules. And so if the idea of the TVA is that it's an illusion to keep everybody off their guard, they wouldn't have to do this whole other investigation. There wouldn't be a threat to the existence of the TVA with somebody collecting these timeline reset capsules. And so I believe that the TVA is an actual thing, even though just explaining the existence of the TVA creates so many fabric ripples in the reality of the Marvel Cinematic Universe that it kind of shakes me to my core of thinking how, if things went wrong with them, how drastic it could affect things going forward in the MCU. I mean, this isn't like someone that's powerful like Thanos, or, you know what it could be getting into is the existence of the Eternals, and how long the Eternals have been around on our planet, and how they have sort of been choosing when and how to get involved, and have let certain things play out. Like, they might be aware of the existence of this sacred timeline, and maybe much like the TVA, they almost have to let things play out because it's determined to be that way. So it's another whole thing to sort of wrap your brain around. And it's, again, kind of mind-blowing that all this is taking place in a Disney Plus television series, and it shows how far ahead of the game Marvel is in sort of planning this stuff out. And as long as they're able to stick the landing and carry Loki through to a story that affects other things going on in the MCU, it's going to be super impressive to see. Now, at the same time, this could also just be a little self-contained story that happens to exist in the time from where Loki got plucked out of Avengers 2012, and until he resolves whatever is happening. Because there's one point where he even says to Agent Mobius, he's like,
I can't go back, can I? Back to my timeline.
And that means that he's existing in the TVA, but the real Loki is still going along the sacred timeline. There's actually two Lokis now at this point, one that's in the TVA and one who is playing out the events of Thor: The Dark World, Ragnarok, and then Avengers Infinity War. How do you resolve that? How do you bring Loki back into the MCU timeline? Do you even do it? Or does he just end up becoming one of these TVA agents who goes on to keep helping Agent Mobius clean up multiple timelines? There's a bunch of different ways you can go forward with this, and God love Kevin Feige because he's able to keep this all straight in his brain. So that is what I took away from episode 1 of Loki. And again, I like I said, it's so much more than what they tried in WandaVision. It's way more than what they did in Falcon and Winter Soldier, which was kind of just a linear MCU storyline. This is grasping for a lot more, and so far it's got me incredibly intrigued. I will admit that I've seen episode 2, so I do know a couple of the answers that are going of where these questions are sort of leading to. including one massive reveal. And it was hard to talk about this stuff without sort of, with keeping those realities separate, but you guys are really going to want to watch episode 2. And I hate that this is only 6 episodes, because I think there's some really massive things that need to be discussed here, and I just love seeing Tom Hiddleston back in the role. So I want to hear from you guys. I want to know what you thought about Loki. I want to know what other questions you maybe had about the existence of the TVA, whether you buy into the Timekeepers, your thoughts on the sacred timeline. I will be back with an episode analysis for number 2 when it drops on Disney+. And if you're here on our YouTube channel, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on your notifications, and keep it here on CinemaBlend for all your Marvel cinematic needs.